Hi there, Professor Chris here. Thank you for joining us for this special edition from TARMA, that's Threat Assessment Risk Mitigation Advisors. Today we're going to be looking at mass shooters. Obviously, it goes without saying that the reason I'm looking at them today is because of the recent shooting in Texas. It is a horrible, horrible tragedy. And I am so sorry for those families. And today I'm going to look back at this shooter and two others to see if we can establish a pattern and maybe do something to prevent this from happening in the future. So, jumping right in, we're starting with the Virginia Tech shooter, Songhi. And he was born on January 18th, 1984 in South Korea and came here with his parents when he was 9. He was very sick as a child. So between that, the cultural differences, and probably some communication issues, he had a hard time creating relationships. Once he reached around middle school age, his work started showing ideations of homicide and suicide. They weren't really addressed as well as they should have been, despite how alarming these works were. Fast forward to high school, when even though he has a GPA of 3.5, he's talking about Columbine in his work, and not in a, an academic sort of way like I am. I'm talking more in admiration, which is alarming in and of itself. He was a social outcast. He went to Virginia Tech despite his parents' objections. And, honestly, I gotta wonder if he didn't choose Virginia Tech because he wanted independence and he wanted distance between him and the people who knew him the best, so that when his personality really started to change, they didn't notice. Now, to their credit, despite the fact that there are Asian cultures out there that don't even believe in mental illness, they did try to help him. And at one point, he was on medications, antidepressants, which he was on for a year, and then he was determined to be okay, so he stopped taking them. One of my biggest pet peeves is when people stop taking medication because they feel better. It's probably one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. But putting a pin in that for just a second, let's look at the fact that he wasn't even held for 24 hours on a psych hold. Now, typically they're around 72 hours because, if they're on something, or if they should be on something, or, any kind of schizophrenic or dissociative identity disorder or anything like that, will usually sort of change in a matter of 72 hours. You're going to see something different. So that can help them, provide a more accurate diagnosis. But, excuse me, when this individual is, in mental lockdown for less than 30 hours, I'm not sure it was even a whole 24 hours, you're not going to get any kind of accurate, understanding of what this person is capable of or what they're going through. And I think that's one of the problems and one of the groups who failed this kid. And again, I do not condone their behavior. But between, the lack of involvement because his parents worked so much when they were raising the kids, between a lack of involvement on their part and then just constantly slipping through the cracks. Yes, the police did talk to him on the campus because a number of his female co-eds had complained about him. So the police, they cornered him and they told him to leave the girls alone. And he replied, "Well, I should just kill myself now." And yet they never took note of that after he'd just been in the hospital, in a psych hospital. He ended up being dropped from a class because of his work. It was slipping, and he got into it with his instructor. So that could have been a trigger. And another possible trigger is when he presented this book proposal to a publisher or something like that, and he was rejected. And at that point, he wasn't even telling his sister what he was doing, which was way out of character for him. They used to talk about everything. So at this point, he's closing off, he's withdrawing. And it's sort of, you can sort of see it, as the timeline, like it's laid out. You can kind of see what's happening. Unfortunately, it comes too late because those 32 people that are dead and the 17 that were wounded, they're going to be changed forever. Well, the families will be changed forever. And there's no coming back from that. I noticed at one point he compared himself to Jesus Christ. So with the issues of violence and so forth, there were clearly delusions of grandeur as well. So next we're going to talk about 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz from Parkland, Florida. And that shooting took place on Valentine's Day of 2018. So, Nicholas Cruz, Valentine's Day 2018, 19 years old, 17 dead, 15 wounded, and interestingly, there we go. With his and the Ramos case that just happened, they use the phrase pure evil to describe what happened, the individual inflicting this horrific tragedy on this community and just tearing it apart. And the reason I say that it's interesting is because these shootings all took place in the Bible Belt. So because 45% of that particular area, we're talking Kentucky and Virginia down over to Texas and Oklahoma, and you've got Arkansas, Louisiana, and all up in there, is the heavily religious part of the country. So for them to describe Cruz and Ramos as pure evil in the press conferences, that doesn't come as a huge surprise. To be fair, they're not wrong. But we don't generally just sort of look at it that way. I mean, that might be in conjunction to other things that we look at, but we don't just accuse evil of doing these things. Someone has to be responsible. And Cruz was the one of the three of them who actually was captured. And recently, he had a court hearing. They were choosing the jurors, and a teacher came in, and she was a middle-aged teacher, and she was wearing a shirt that had victims' names on it or some kind of reference to the shooting, and they had to sequester the jury and change a whole bunch of things and whatever. I mean, I can't even imagine what she's going through or what any of them are going through, but you know, it's not really something you wear to court. Um, so Cruz had 17 dead and 15 to his name. And, you know, again, 19 years old, underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. Um, of course, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for the impulse control and the cognitive functioning. So um, the AR-15 was the weapon of choice with him as well. And 6 months prior to the shooting, he posted that YouTube video where he said that he was going to be a professional school shooter. So that would have been around August of 2017. And then fast forward to November of 2017, his mom died, which could quite possibly have been a trigger. And then February, he was expelled from school, and that's when the shooting happened. So again, not condoning the behavior, but there were a number of things that contributed to the anger and the hate that caused these kids to do this. I guess what I'm having a hard time with, probably most of all, is how can these kids keep getting their hands on, you know, these weapons? I don't understand it. I'm all about, you know, gun rights and whatever. Hell, I live in New Hampshire, so it's, you know, live free or die, right? Or I like to say live free or die trying, but we don't have requirements. We don't have requirements for um, permits, concealed or open carry. So I'm having a hard time understanding how these kids are getting their hands on AR-15s, especially since if you look throughout the history of mass shootings, it's been mostly young white men who have committed them. Yeah. So there's that. Next, we're going to look at Uvalde and Salvador Ramos and the most recent shooting in Texas. Okay, so details are still coming in on the Uvalde shooting, but this is what I know based on the research that I've done and talking to some colleagues in the field. So we have Salvador Ramos, 18 years old. The morning of the shooting, he shot and wounded his 66-year-old grandmother. Now, originally, she was wounded. At this point, I believe she's deceased. I'm getting conflicting information, so it's kind of hard to pin anything down. So the information that I'm giving you is, for the most part, pieces of information that I found that were consistent regardless of where I found them or where they came from. He was also a social outcast. He was bullied because he had a speech impediment, and there was something about his clothes he was bullied about as well. I don't know what their financial situation was, so I can't say what exactly was about the clothes. But the kids at school actually called him the school shooter. It's almost like the labeling theory. You know, you say something about someone enough and they start to believe it. Again, not condoning his behavior, but I would be interested to know what the correlation was between the kids that were shot and the kids that bullied him. Because when he went to high school, but he had dropped out. And there were conflicting statements as to whether it was because he dropped out that he was arguing with his grandmother that morning, or if it was because of a phone bill. I've seen different facts. But just before the shooting, he did message someone on social media and he said, I'm going to shoot my grandmother. And then a few minutes later, he's like, I shot my grandmother. And then a little bit after that, he was like, I'm going to go shoot up the school. And what do you know? That's exactly what he did. Now, 4 years prior, he was arrested for a domestic situation. 14 years old. So I'm guessing that because he was underage, those records were sealed. But I can't help but wonder if there's something that could have been done to unseal or otherwise get a hold of those documents prior to him being allowed to buy an AR-15. And what was it, 375 rounds? To kill 19 children, 2 teachers, and wound 17 others. Also, depending on where you look for the information, he may or may not have been confronted by an armed school security officer, but he did get into the school anyways, obviously. Allegedly, he wounded 2 police officers and engaged in a standoff for over an hour. So there were specialized law enforcement officers, LEOs, who breached the 2 adjoining classrooms to where he was located, and he had them barricaded in. I'm guessing it was probably SWAT. Oh, excuse me. It might have been SWAT, but I also heard it was a border patrol team. So because this location was 50 miles away from the Mexican border. So, I mean, it could have been either. The gunman, Ramos, was killed just after 1 o'clock, and that comes from state officials. Yeah, he bought 2 assault rifles on his 18th birthday, and on March 18th, he bought 375 rounds. 375 rounds. That's a lot of friggin' ammo. There was one parent that had suggested rushing the school because, quote, the cops aren't doing anything like they're supposed to. More could have been done. Now, I could not imagine what he was feeling, knowing his daughter was in that school and she ended up getting shot. People do act in erratic, unpredictable ways when they're emotional, and I cannot think of any more emotional situation than, you know, your kid being barricaded in a classroom with a shooter. I can't even. So I get it, but at the same time, if they weren't actually doing anything, there's a reason why. Maybe they couldn't get a visual on who was alive inside or where he was located, or, you know, maybe he closed the blinds so they couldn't see inside. Who knows? The public safety director, McCraw, says that law enforcement was in fact there. He claims that they engaged immediately and they contained the shooter in the classroom. That comes from AP News. And it was a half an hour before the shooting that Ramos sent the first of the 3 messages as a warning, and that was on Facebook. You know what really baffles me is all the stupid crap that Facebook, you know, blocks us or bans us or puts us in Facebook jail for, and this happened. Where was the screening or whatever when this happened? They should have some kind of algorithm that picks up words like the ones he used to prevent this from happening. From the political angle, Democrat Beto O'Rourke, he was running against Greg Abbott for governor, and he was not pulling any punches. He was pointing his finger and, throwing accusations at Abbott, saying that it was Abbott's fault and it was going to continue until he did something about it. I mean, he was just going off on this guy. So those are the 3 school shooters that I chose to talk about today. And, looking at this kid, again, not condoning his behavior, but drug addict mother, grandfather's a convicted felon who claims that he never saw the guns, and if he had, he would have told his parole officer, whatever, like, ex-cons never lie. I don't know. I can't prove it. Maybe he's on the level. The grandmother was trying to get the mother kicked out of where she was living because of her drug problems. And the kid, Salvador Ramos, was complaining about the eviction and publicizing it on social media. And I don't really understand that, because if you're, embarrassed or having a difficulty with a specific situation, I think the last thing to do is to publish it on social media. But he's a kid, a dead kid, but he was a kid. I just feel like there should be more done to prevent these things from happening. Instead of, us having to do psychological breakdowns after the fact. Because, yeah, we can learn from that, but at that point it's already too late. And I think it's absolutely disgusting that I had so many different shooters to choose from. It's ridiculous. So, thank you for hanging in there with us, and take care.